So over the last decade, ancestry testing companies have made tens of millions of dollars. AncestryDNA, based in Utah, is by far the biggest player in this field, followed by 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. The marketing for these products is ubiquitous. If you have a television, you have undoubtedly seen testimonials like the following.
Growing up, we were German. We danced in a German dance group. I wore lederhosen. When I first got on Ancestry, I was really surprised that I wasn't finding all of these Germans in my tree. I decided to have my DNA tested through AncestryDNA. The big surprise was we're not German at all. 52% of my DNA comes from Scotland and Ireland. So I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt.
Now, there are a lot of people like Kyle. Almost 30 million people worldwide have taken DNA-based ancestry tests. In 2018, more people took genetic ancestry tests than in all previous years combined. And analysts predict, if current interest levels remain, that by 2021, this number will exceed 100 million. What this shows is that we're very interested in our genetic makeups and in our genealogies. We're seeking a richer understanding of ourselves and our identities, and perhaps a stronger sense of connectedness to our ancestors. And you could ask, what could possibly be wrong with that? If Kyle's ancestry test leads him to trade in his lederhosen for a kilt, so what, right? The challenge arises when one considers that DNA ancestry tests are touted as revealing a person's real or true racial or ethnic identity. We saw this conflation of race and genetics in the back and forth between Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren. You'll recall that in 2018, Trump told Warren, I will give $1 million to your favorite charity, paid for by Trump, if you take the DNA ancestry test and it shows you're an Indian. Now, Trump's argument, at least initially, was that the DNA test would reveal who Warren really is. We also see this reduction of race or ethnicity to a genetic code in Kyle's testimonial. Note that Kyle said he grew up German. His family danced in a German dance group. He wore lederhosen. They no doubt ate German-inspired food. Yet Kyle largely abandoned his German cultural heritage for a new ethnicity based solely on biology. That is, based on his DNA ancestry test results. This raises the question, should genetic tests determine or be used as a proxy for race or ethnicity? In Kyle's case, you may say, who cares if he trades in his lederhosen for a kilt? But consider the following. For most of his life, Ralph Taylor identified as white. In 2010, however, Taylor began identifying as Black after DNA test results indicated that he was 90% Caucasian, 6% Indigenous American, and 4% Sub-Saharan African. Based on these results, Taylor, who owns an insurance company in the state of Washington, sought government certification as a minority-owned business in order to augment his chances of securing government business. When the government refused the requested certification, Taylor sued, alleging race discrimination. Consider also Cleon Brown. For most of his life, Brown, a police officer in Hastings, Michigan, identified as white. When genetic tests indicated that 18% of his DNA traced to sub-Saharan Africa, Brown shared this information with his colleagues. Brown alleged that his fellow officers subsequently subjected him to a racially hostile environment. Among other things, Brown alleged that the police chief called him Punta after the main character, an enslaved African in Alex Haley's 1976 novel, Roots, that colleagues whispered Black Lives Matter when Brown passed them in the department's corridors, that someone put a Santa with 18% written on it in Brown's office Christmas stocking, and that the Hastings mayor, upon learning of Brown's ancestry test results, told Brown a racist joke, repeatedly using the word Negroid. Brown sued the city of Hastings for race discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These examples demonstrate what we call genetic race, the heavy or exclusive reliance on DNA ancestry test results in constructing one's identity. These examples also demonstrate some of the complex questions raised by direct-to-consumer DNA ancestry tests. For example, what is race? How should society and anti-discrimination law respond when an individual's genetic race conflicts with their previously self-identified race or the race that others perceive them to be, their observed or ascribed races? Are Ralph Taylor and Cleon Brown Black? Second, should they be able to proceed with their race discrimination claims? Should court recognize these claims and allow them to proceed? Three, how should genetic notions of race affect assessments of diversity in organizations? Should employers, colleges, and demographers rely upon DNA ancestry tests when measuring diversity? Should Ralph Taylor be eligible for race-based affirmative action? And four, what are some other possible consequences of genetic race? So let's start with the first question. Are Ralph and Cleon Black based upon their DNA ancestry test results? In our paper, we respond no for two reasons. First, as my co-author Jessica Roberts will now explain, there are limitations with the tests themselves.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Trina. So we thought that it might be a fun and interactive way to begin this conversation about DNA ancestry tests with a poll to y'all, our participants. So we are curious, before this seminar this evening, did you know personally about DNA ancestry tests? And have you personally taken a DNA ancestry test? So let's see I'll give you all a little bit of time to answer. And then when we have a sufficient number, I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results. Okay, folks are still answering. All right, maybe do 10 seconds more. Anyone else want to answer? Okay, excellent. And I will go ahead and share these results with y'all. And since I believe in the context of these recordings, it doesn't always record the polling results. So 100% of those of you that answered said you had in fact heard of these tests. That's not surprising given how ubiquitous these services are. But only 23% of y'all had actually taken a DNA ancestry test yourself, which means that 77% of y'all have not. So in the interest of full disclosure, I have in fact taken a DNA ancestry test. And I'm actually going to share some of my results with you all momentarily. And I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about why that's something I did or felt comfortable doing. But if you've not taken one of these tests, we thought it might be useful to just tell you a bit how this testing process unfolds. So typically, a consumer purchases a genetic testing kit and then sends in a sample for analysis. And this usually takes the form of a cheek swab or buccal swab or a vial of spit. Then, after the company gets your sample, the DNA ancestry company compares it to the samples in its database. Now, it's worth taking a moment and noting that human beings are 99.9% genetically similar. So that means that all of human variation comes down to that 0.1%. Also, we are even more genetically similar to our relatives. So that means a genetic testing company can predict the degrees of a relationship between two people by looking for genetic similarity or homozygosity. Genes are passed down through generations, and the more similar two people are genetically, the closer the familial relation. And I want to emphasize that this aspect of the technology works. So this particular slide, this is me and my cousin, Emily, and I was on AncestryDNA, as I mentioned, and it matched me with my first cousin and told me that based on our genetic similarity, it was likely that we shared grandparents, and of course that was correct. The thing is, I didn't even know that she was on the service, but it managed to find us and connect us. And these kinds of familial matches are actually the technology that allowed police to solve crimes, like in the case of the Golden State Killer. Now, in addition to predicting genetic relatedness, like the relationship between me and my cousin, these companies also purport to provide people with information regarding their ethnicities or their geographic origins. And it is these aspects of DNA testing that are often conflated with race. Companies predict geographic origin by taking the individual's DNA and comparing it to the database based on assumptions about population genetics and human migratory patterns. Again, it has to do with degrees of genetic similarity. Certain genetic variants occur more commonly in particular populations. Those populations can be linked to particular geographic regions. The testing companies then use that information to predict a person's geographic ancestry. So if your DNA looks enough like the DNA of other people in the database who have labeled themselves as Slavic, the company will then label you as Slavic. Now, these testing companies might give you your results in a couple different ways. So I mentioned that I took a DNA ancestry test, and here are my results. I think it is worth noting that my results have since changed since we first made these slides a few months ago. But you can see here, Ancestry is reporting the results as an ethnicity estimate. And then if we go to the next slide, family tree DNA, and this is the DNA test of my dad, returns its results as an estimate of continental or geographic origin. Now, because the analysis of geographic origin requires additional assumptions about human evolution and migratory patterns, it is inherently less accurate than the predictions about genetic relatedness that just assess genetic similarity. So what does that mean? There are a few different takeaways that are relevant to our paper. And we can go to the next slide. So here are some things that are important for the purposes of our analysis. First, there is no such thing as genetic race from a scientific perspective. Scientists have found more genetic variation within racial categories than between racial categories. In other words, human beings do not cluster comfortably into clear categories based on genetics alone. We cannot, therefore, use genetics to quote unquote test for race. Secondly, and related to this point, there is no gene, quote unquote, for whiteness, blackness, or any other category. Now, this reality may seem confusing because you've undoubtedly heard that certain kinds of health conditions occur more frequently in particular racial or ethnic groups. So we can consider Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs is a well-known condition that affects Ashkenazi Jews at a higher rate. However, not all people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent are carriers of Tay-Sachs, and not all carriers of Tay-Sachs are of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. So whether you are a carrier for Tay-Sachs cannot always accurately predict ancestry. It can give you some predictive value, but to predict DNA ancestry, these companies do this kind of analysis on a wide scale, although typically not with variants that code for health conditions. So these realities mean that whether you get tagged as being from a particular group or a particular place depends on the database of the company that you are using and its algorithm for determining matches. This means, of course, that as a result, you could get different DNA ancestry results from different companies because of their differing databases and algorithms. And if a company updates their database or algorithm, your results could change. As I mentioned, AncestryDNA did that relatively recently, and people did not like it. One customer whose son had taken the test called the change in results quite upsetting because that's his identity, end quote. So hopefully I've encouraged you to question at least somewhat the scientific validity of DNA ancestry tests as proxies for race.
In addition to problems with the technology, DNA ancestry test results should not be conflated with race because genetic race is eerily similar to, indeed we argue, a modern installment of biological race. In the paper, we trace the history of racial science, the pernicious uses of biological race, and the ways in which law has buttressed biological race before explaining that race is a sociopolitical, not a biological concept. As Professor Roberts just said, the predominant view among scientists and academics is that biological races do not exist. No single genetic characteristic is exclusive to any socially constructed racial group. Moreover, the genetic variation between racial groups is small when compared to the genetic variation within those groups. To be sure, morphological differences in hair and skin tone between racial groups are genetically based, but science has not demonstrated that the genes responsible for these characteristics also account for attributes that we commonly assign to racial groups. Differences, for example, with regards to language, morality, intellect, propensity for criminal behavior, sexuality, physicality. Again, is worth repeating. There is no gene for race. Although physical characteristics, among other things, may be used to place individuals within racial categories, these characteristics are not race. Race is the social meaning that we ascribe to these characteristics. It's a constantly evolving product of the ways in which a society construes differences and attaches meaning to those differences. And it encompasses the lived experiences that people have as a result of being raced. If race is a sociopolitical concept, then neither Brown nor Taylor are Black, nor should they be candidates for affirmative action to the extent that affirmative action programs serve a remedial purpose, that is to ensure greater access to opportunity for historically marginalized groups. But you might say, but what about Cleon, right? Isn't he a little different from Ralph Taylor, who was trying to access a race-based affirmative action program? Even if he's not Black, according to our analysis, shouldn't he be able to bring a legal claim? After all, there's something unsettling, right, about a person being subject to the types of behaviors to which Brown was subject. There are two avenues for legal relief at Brown's disposal: the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Jessica's going to talk briefly about GINA.
Excellent. So the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, as Trina mentioned, is a statute that is an employment discrimination statute. It's actually a little-known federal protection, and it prevents genetic information discrimination in health insurance and in employment, and we focus here on employment. Now, GINA was ostensibly passed to make people feel more comfortable taking medical genetic tests, but nothing in the plain language of the statute requires that covered genetic information has to communicate health risk. So if I could have the next slide. So you can see here is GINA's definition of genetic information. It's an individual's genetic test, the genetic tests of her family members, and family medical history. So nothing in the statute itself requires the genetic information to actually provide medical risk data or information about proclivities for disease. And at least one court has applied a more expansive definition going beyond medical genetic tests that applies GINA to genetic tests that reveal other kinds of information. Now that opinion is known as the case of the devious defecator. It was a case that was out of the Northern District of Georgia in 2015. And what happened in this case is that an employer learned that someone, it assumed a disgruntled employee, had been pooping in its warehouse. Obviously, the employer wanted to stop this. So based on timing and who had access, the employer narrowed its search down to two suspects, Jack Lowe and Dennis Reynolds. The employer then enlisted the help of a direct-to-consumer forensic testing company. While the testing ultimately exonerated them, the two employees sued under GINA, alleging that their employer unlawfully requested their genetic information. The employer responded that the information it sought was for identification purposes only. It was seeking to compare their genetic information to the DNA that was found in the poop. But that argument was not convincing to the court. So despite arguing that GINA does not cover genetic testing that is not medical in nature, the court looked again to the plain language of the statute on the slide here, and it found that forensic genetic tests, despite the absence of conveying medical information, were nonetheless covered by GINA. We believe that applying GINA to direct-to-consumer forensic testing opens the door for applying it to DNA ancestry tests. In fact, GINA may have some advantages as a basis for recovery over Title VII. In particular, GINA's greatest strength is that it allows plaintiffs to claim that they face discrimination on the basis of a DNA ancestry test without having to address whether the person is a member of a protected class under Title VII. However, GINA has certain shortcomings as well. Mainly, if a person is facing genetic racism, is that discrimination because of their genetic information or because of their race? And for these reasons, we also engage in Title VII analysis.
Okay, so Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Interestingly, Title VII prescribes discrimination on the basis of classifications, race, sex, religion, and not classes, African American, Latinx, Muslim, being a woman, right? And in bringing a claim, courts have historically interpreted Title VII to require that a plaintiff show membership in a protected class. That usually isn't a problem, but in a series of cases called misperception cases, courts have been interpreting this membership in a protected class requirement to require that you actually be a member of the class that's being maligned. So for example, imagine a person identifies as Latinx, but that individual is perceived by their employer as Black and is subject as a result to anti-Black racism. The individual wants to bring a claim of race discrimination under Title VII, but some courts have rejected this claim because the person is not a member of the class, Black, that is the target of discrimination. This is called the authenticity or the actuality requirement. We think that this line of cases is wrong, right? If the thrust behind Title VII is to eliminate discriminatory actions by employers based upon race, then what we need to do is to focus on the basis upon which the employer acted, what animated the employer's behavior, not on whether the plaintiff fits within a particular class. So if you were to apply this to the Cleon Brown case, even if we conclude, pursuant to our analysis, that Cleon is not Black, if the employer, the city of Hastings, acted based upon its perception of his race, then we argue that under Title VII, he ought to be able to bring a claim because Title VII is designed to eradicate race discrimination in the workplace. So these are some of the broad technical and legal questions that are raised by DNA ancestry tests, but these tests raise other really complicated issues. For example, we've noticed that there's an interesting one-sidedness to the process of self-discovery. White individuals are using a small percentage of sub-Saharan ancestry to claim Blackness, but we do not see African Americans relying upon a small percentage of Western European ancestry to claim whiteness. So if I were to take a test, and let's say, which I haven't, let's say that the test revealed that 20% of my ancestry traced to Western Europe, and let's assume that I were to claim that I was white as a result of this, my claim to whiteness would strike many of you as farcical, as ridiculous. What this shows is the persistence of the rule of hypodescent, the one-drop rule, the idea that one drop of Black blood makes one Black, but white ancestry does not make one white. So it's easier to access a subordinate status rather than a privileged status. Whiteness in our racial reality, in our racial scheme, remains inaccessible and off limits. Changes in racial identity based upon DNA ancestry tests raise also questions concerning racial fraud and cultural appropriation. So consider the person who identified as white, non-Hispanic throughout her life, but who decides to learn Spanish, change her name from Mary to Maria, to wear traditional Mexican attire, and perhaps to eat more Mexican food after receiving ancestry test results reporting that she possesses Mexican ancestry. Or what if Rachel Dolezal or Jessica Krug, the women who led people to believe they were Black, had had a DNA test to ground their claims to a Black identity? Would that make it okay for Dolezal to don hairstyles and dress that some Black women wear to celebrate aspects of our Black heritage, or to purse her lips in photos to make them look fuller? And back to Elizabeth Warren. Lots of white individuals claim Indigenous heritage. The question is, are these individuals engaging in racial fraud? If they alter their identity performance when they change their identity, are they donning something akin to blackface, meaning performing a caricatured version of what they think it means to be a member of one of these groups? Are they trivializing and downplaying the experiences of people within marginalized racial groups? And is this unsettling? It certainly was for members of the Cherokee Nation with regards to Elizabeth Warren. And I'm going to play a short clip of an interview, an NPR interview with Chuck Hoskin, who at the time was the Secretary of State for the Cherokee Nation, and now he is the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation.
The general question is just about the really large number of people that many of us have encountered in everyday life who say they have some native ancestry. Are they taking advantage of you in some way by not being members of the Cherokee Nation or whatever nation, but saying that they have this background?
Well, often it is about appropriating our identity and our culture. We fought long and hard for this status. It's a legal status that was nearly extinguished by the government of the United States. It's a legal status that we use to fight for the rights of Native children, to protect our lands. And when someone comes in and boasts that they took a DNA test so they're Indian, we think that erodes what it means to be a Native American in this country, even if they don't claim a specific tribal nation citizenship.
Professor Asamudia James raised similar concerns when commenting on Rachel Dolezal a few years ago. She said there are many positives associated with being Black, but there are also actual day-to-day psychic tolls, right, that accompany Blackness. She went on to say the experience of Blackness often includes subtle, indelible phenomena, the learning as a child of racial narratives of inferiority, the frustration of navigating a society where education about white supremacy and how it intersects with gender, class, and other constructs is withheld. The labor of Black caregivers who cultivate resiliency and pride in their little ones despite the experience of racial struggle. She said, our resilience is born out of a childhood that, yes, presents challenges and exposes us to stigma, but also results in a lived day-to-day racial experience that enriches our lives and informs the world, an experience to which others may not fraudulently lay claim. In addition to this concern, we close by discussing one additional future implication, and there are many, but we're going to focus on one, and that is the implications of genetic race in the context of immigration.
Excellent. So, not surprisingly, we also caution against relying on these DNA ancestry tests as proxies for race, ethnicity, and national origin in the context of immigration. So to date, the United States has not incorporated genetic race into immigration proceedings, but if the United States chose to, there is certainly groundwork to do so. To start, other countries have used and then abandoned immigration policies that use genetic race, and I will say a bit more about one such effort momentarily. Additionally, the United States has recently expanded its DNA collection at the border, and immigration officials have, in certain circumstances, relied on genetic tests to establish family relatedness. So how might an immigration policy based on genetic race operate? We can look to the UK's failed Human Provenance Project as an example. Like in the US, there were concerns that asylum applicants in the UK were fabricating their claims. The UK Borders Agency decided to institute the Human Provenance Project in 2009. This project allowed applicants in cases of suspected fraud to volunteer their DNA. And the project planned to use a variety of different kinds of genetic testing to verify applicants' countries of origin and their nationality. Not surprisingly, this created a backlash in the scientific community. So a 2009 article in Nature called the program, quote, scientifically flawed, ethically dubious, and potentially damaging to science, end quote. And it also said that, quote, the idea that genetic information follows national boundaries is absurd, end quote. There was also a similar article in Science in 2009, and we have that slide here. And the authors there called this program horrifying, naive, and flawed. And one said, my first reaction is that this is wildly premature, even ignoring the moral and ethical aspects. So experts within the sciences were deeply, deeply skeptical. They feared that this project represented an improper use of science. There was insufficient comparison data for many of the groups that were implicated. Nationality is, of course, socio-political, not genetic. And the results, as I explained at the beginning of our presentation, are themselves not always accurate and subject to change. Lawyers and human rights advocates also criticized the Human Provenance Project, that it led to injustice and invalidated otherwise legitimate claims, that officials and judges may overvalue the genetic test results because of their seeming objectivity, and also that many of these applicants lacked counsel and would be subject to manipulation. So the idea of voluntariness would be extremely problematic, given that they might actually, in fact, feel compelled to submit to genetic testing. Now, eventually, the UK did abandon this program. In October 2009, right around when it started, it was temporarily halted. They modified and resumed it in November 2009. In March 2011, it concluded, and by June of 2011, it had been abandoned completely. We therefore urge lawmakers and immigration officials in the United States to view the Human Provenance Project as a cautionary tale and reject DNA ancestry tests as proxies for race, ethnicity, or national origin. Unfortunately, racism in the context of immigration would be nothing new in the United States. There are clear historical examples like the Asian Exclusion Act and other racially or ethnically motivated immigration bans of the past, but we have plenty of recent examples of xenophobia and nativism. The Muslim ban, the president's referring to certain places as shithole countries, construing Mexicans as criminals and rapists. So sadly, the idea that our immigration policies could be influenced by racist ideologies is not far-fetched. I will turn it back to Trina now for some concluding thoughts.
So in conclusion, DNA ancestry tests seem like such a simple little thing, right? Take a test, learn more about yourself. What we hope our paper will show is that things are a lot more complicated. These tests have significant social and public policy implications. So think before you spit. Thank you so much for your time. We're happy to hear feedback and to respond to questions.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. If you have questions, you can either raise your hand in Zoom and we can call on you and then you can speak face to face, or you can put it in the chat and I will read it out for you. I don't know, whatever you are most comfortable.
And if you don't have a question, we're happy to hear commentary as well. Maybe we convinced everybody in the Zoom.
Hi, I'm Brooks Benby. I'm a freshman, and I have a question. It's kind of related. have you had any evidence that these companies have sold the DNA data to like outside companies? And I was wondering about the privacy laws related to DNA.
Yes. Okay. So that's an excellent question. Yeah, the companies have pretty publicly make data sales. So, you know, one of the other popular direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies is, of course, 23andMe, and they very publicly have made deals, multi-million-dollar deals with pharmaceutical companies. So this actually relates to some of the other work that I do. Really, it's kind of the regulatory Wild West with these direct-to-consumer genetic tests. If it's medical testing, that may in certain circumstances get some regulation by the FDA, but this is not, as we discussed, medical genetic testing. So often these kinds of direct-to-consumer genetic tests go unregulated. So if there's some kind of a dispute, it's probably going to be governed by the terms of conditions and the privacy policies. You know, those things that we all ignore and then we click through them, or, you know, we don't read the emails when there's updates. And, you know, these companies, even though people were outraged at the data sales, you know, if you read the fine print, you may be consenting to particular uses of your genetic information. The companies vary with their practices regarding, you know, that level of sharing. Like, for example, some companies or DNA testing services or DNA platforms will say, like, they automatically share information with law enforcement. Others will say you have to consent. But this is all to say it's not very well regulated, and it's governed by these privacy policies and terms and conditions. And almost all of these companies, if probably all of these companies, reserve the right to change those provisions without user consent. So that's an entirely different issue.
You mentioned the fact that, was it 23andMe who has the connection to Google?
Yes. So that's I think the CEO of 23andMe is in fact the ex-spouse of the CEO or one of the people high up in Google. I mean, there's you know, there was some commentary during the data sale, right, that, you know, 23andMe wasn't selling $99 genetic tests, it was selling data. So you're not 23andMe's customer, you're 23andMe's product. So that the real consumers are the pharmaceutical companies and these other companies. Now, clearly the ancestry information is a different set of information because it doesn't carry medical risk in the same kind of a way, but it's still something that people might find interesting and want to mine for sure.
Our next question is from Randy Jennings.
So with the Human Provenance Project, it seems to be like another example in the trend where scientists are either being misunderstood or their, you know, cries that this isn't how their work should be interpreted are being completely ignored. So what do you think is the role of policymakers or the law in preventing that from happening in the future?
So, I mean, it's difficult because we're in a world, unfortunately, at the moment where there's a great distrust for science and scientists. And so setting that aside, I think it is the job of policymakers, lawmakers, lawyers, legislators to work with scientists to make sure that anything that they do implement would be evidence-based. And I think that if anyone behind the Human Provenance Project had bothered to consult with scientists, they probably would have gotten shut down relatively quickly. And so I think that, you know, we just need to do a good job of listening to the scientists. But I also want to say, unfortunately, that science itself is not free from bias. And so we should also at times, you know, regard science and its findings with healthy skepticism, but at a minimum, we need to start with evidence-based policymaking.
Dr. Lee Baker.
Hey, Trina. It's good to see you, Jessica. This was a fantastic and mind-blowing conversation. As you know, I'm very interested in some of these issues. what I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate is the minuscule differences that these companies are trying to bucket into geographical areas. I oftentimes in my class tell everyone that on both genetic and biological grounds, everyone should just say, I am of African descent, because most of the diversity is in Africa today, and the little bit that's not is so closely African that the whole ancestry DNA should say they're all African and then a little bit of European. But because we have these categories, these minuscule little differences are seen some as not African, but they're all like African and then a little bit of European. And we then put these geographical like subpopulations into the races, and that becomes the problem. I mean, there is human diversity. You can map it on geographically, but then we do the work of saying we're placing these small, minuscule differences into these large categories that could be Eastern European, African, Mediterranean, whatever. And I think it's really incumbent on people to really understand that we're doing the work of making race out of very minuscule population genetics. And I think that's the thing. That said, I was adopted and don't know anything about my heritage. And I found my biological mother sleuthing around through different cousins and half cousins and Ancestry's DNA's ancestry stuff, you know, the genealogy stuff. And it was a hoot. And I've got a first cousin who's now we're in touch, and it's very lovely, particularly because I don't have any biological family. I mean, family that I'm related to, opposed to my own daughter. So it is kind of interesting in that respect, but the family piece is really, I think, interesting.
Yeah, and so I think, oh, sorry, Trina, do you want to?
I think that you, Professor Baker and Professor Roberts will have a lot to talk about offline, because as she mentioned during her presentation, she discovered, right, one of her cousins. And I think that, Jessica, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong because you're the expert with regards to the technology. Making these familial connections is something that the technology does fairly well, right? But it's the distant geographical reach and the misleading nature of that that seems to be problematic. I wanted to pick up on something that you said, Lee, with regards to we should all just claim to be of African descent, because that has been used, right, by more conservative individuals like Justice Scalia, who said we're just all the human race, right, to discount the salience of socially constructed race, racial hierarchy, and racial inequality. So people say, well, you know, if we all trace back to Africa, then we're all just humans. Let's just not pay attention to race, right, or racial difference. We should just be, you know, celebrate our multi-racialism, right, and just forget about race. We talk in the paper about this counter argument, this argument that we're just all one race, the human race, because we're all mixed up and we all descended from one place. And what we argue is that even though there's been racial mixing, right, as long as humans have been on the planet, and certainly since you had the arrival of enslaved Africans on North American shores in 1619, there's been race mixing in this country, yet racial hierarchy and racial inequality has existed alongside all of this racial mixing in the United States. Now, one could say, well, you know, there were concerted efforts, right, through anti-miscegenation statutes and other legal devices to erase the mixed race population in the United States, not to allow them to have a separate legal identity. But even if you look in other places like Brazil, which had a policy of encouraging mixed racial identity or race mixing, right? Even in social contexts like Brazil, you have, Brazil likes to deny that it has racism, but Brazil has a racial hierarchy that is very similar to what you see in the United States. So this idea, right, that we're all the human race, we're all mixed up, right, and therefore we should ignore race and racial inequality lies counter to the history of the United States as well as history in other places. And indeed, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the wonderful sociologist who is one of our colleagues at Duke, has argued that this mixed racial identity argument, instead of eradicating racial hierarchy, is just leading to a more nuanced racial hierarchy in the United States, with Black persons at the bottom, mixed race persons and others in the middle who have some claim perhaps to whiteness, but who will never be deemed to be entirely white, and then whites at the top. So instead of abolishing racial hierarchy, what we have with this argument is a more nuanced, right, racial hierarchy in the United States. So I wanted to use your comment just to speak to the counter argument you frequently hear in discourse on this subject.
So if that is correct.
Now you want to have a debate.
No, and I didn't say everyone should say that they're Black. I said of African descent, and I think that's a nuanced difference. Part of the reason I was going with that is that genetics and sort of human variation has nothing to do with race. I'm reading Isabella Wilkerson's book on caste right now, and she makes a compelling argument that's it's really not about race either. It's about caste, and that race is just the tool of which we have these subordinated castes in America that do the work of keeping some people subordinated through ideas of pollution, through ideas of tracking of work, through ideas of inferiority, and sort of industrialized terrorism and institutionalized dehumanization. And that's about categories of racial caste that have nothing to do with genetic variations. And so I think that's really important to understand, that these categories in different countries, so South Africa is a little bit different, Germany with the Third Reich was different, and then the United States, and then India with its caste system, it looks very similar, have these ideas of genetic or in categories of difference, but it has nothing to do with actual human variability, just subtle ideas of what people look like. You know, I'd be curious, Valerie Lambert, to hear her comments on this coming from the indigenous side of things, but I just wanted to throw that out there, that these technically are minuscule little differences when you're talking about human diversity, but they're huge differences when you're talking about the social construction of race and the caste system.
Absolutely. And I was teasing you when I said you want to have a debate based upon our long friendship. We have, you know, we agree with what you're saying. I just wanted to use your comment as an opportunity to talk about some of the pushback that you'll see in lay discourse of this issue.
And I think that the fact that it's that teeny bit of difference is why they so often get it wrong. Anyway, but
all I was going to say is we actually had a question from Valerie Lambert. So she is a member of the Choctaw Nation, and she asks, will you discuss the current state of databases of so-called Native American ancestry? I've heard that relatively few American Indians have participated in the genetic testing that creates these databases. Is that the case?
that is the case. In fact, these databases are predominantly people of European descent or ancestry, and they are not as good at, so it's questionable what they're predicting anyway, insofar as they're good at predicting any of these fine sort of geographic ties. You know, the more people you have in a database from a particular region, the more likely you are to get a quote unquote accurate result. But yeah, there is very, very little, there are very few people in the database of Native American descent, therefore making these very bad at detecting this particular type of ancestry.
Another question from the comments is Dr. Shram Zapata asks, in the Cleon Brown case, are there other avenues such as unprofessional conduct that would be independent of race in ending the harassment he experienced?
So we looked at this as a race discrimination claim, and we were looking at discrimination law and whether he'd have recourse under race discrimination law. There is no general, correct me again, Jessica, if I'm wrong, there's no general federal law that prohibits bullying or just general bad conduct in the workplace unless it's based upon a protected classification. right? Like race, color, religion, sex, or national origin or ability. It could be the case, but query how much weight you might put into this, that there may have been some internal ethical guidelines with regards to policing that were in place in the state of Michigan, in the city of Hastings, but that's not what he used in asserting a claim for redress. He actually turned to Title VII and anti-discrimination law. So I suspect that if there were such a policy in place, it probably wasn't effectively enforced because that's not the vehicle that he used to try to get some compensation for what he experienced. Jessica, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that sounds 100% accurate. You know, maybe there would be some kind of internal, you know, workplace conduct rules or something, but I don't think anything that would be actionable, like you were saying. So, yeah.
So I'm going to switch up the order a bit. I'm going to allow Zach Pratcher to ask his question in person, and then we have 2 questions from the chat, and then we are done. So thank you so much.
So I was wondering about since race is more of a social and political construct than genetic, if there's a researcher studying studying the epigenome, wherein social factors may play a part in genetic expression, to what extent is race a viable classification for the results of the study?
That is an excellent question, and I think that so folks are definitely studying that. That is something that's outside the scope of this particular project, right? So this is the idea that certain social impacts and stress can actually affect our genome, not on the genetic code level, but on this epigenetic level. And I would say that that ties in more generally with what folks would call the social determinants of health. And so I personally would not want to think of that in terms of race or ethnicity by virtue of, you know, we don't want to reify these categories as biological, and we could look at some of the varying social factors and their effects on the epigenome. But I'm sure people are doing that research, but they need to be conscientious in the same way I think other genetic researchers are, that when you're talking about things that are the social determinants of health, you know, while there are health disparities related to particular groups, that we don't sort of allow those categories to collapse on each other and you know, incorrectly reify biological race. But Trina, I don't know if you have thoughts on this one. It's a hard question, but a good question. I'm sure folks are doing that research though.
Nope, I think that's fine.
So another question came from Emma Battle, and she asked, one of the things that ancestry tests do is clearly connect some African Americans to slaveholders. What are the potential legal implications of that?
So do you want to take this, Jessica, because it's talking about familial. Go ahead.
That's okay.
Then I'll follow up.
Yeah. No, I think that it's, you know, it's that this is familial ties, so we can say that this is relatively accurate. Whether or not there's some sort of legal recourse, I think is a different question. So what are the implications, you know, sort of for personal identity purposes? Well, you know, you have uncovered some information about your lineage. But Trina, if you want to jump in on what the sort of legal consequences of discovering those aspects of your heritage are, I think that would be great.
Well, I think that's a really great question. Thank you, Emma. So what the research reveals is that, and Alondra Nelson, who's a sociologist out of Columbia, has written extensively about African Americans and their use of these types of devices and other things. What the research shows is that African Americans tend not to engage in the sort of genetic reductionism, right? So they use this information along with other types of information, right, to understand their genealogy. So they put weight on family history, right? And also remember that African Americans have a broader conception of family that's not limited to genetics, right? African American families often included aunties and uncles who had no sort of immediate familial relationships. So when African Americans tend to get this information, they actually use it as a part of a larger analysis of their genealogy. And so that has been shown in some of the information, and Alondra writes very clearly and persuasively with regards to that dimension. Many scholars, including not only Alondra Nelson, but Fatal Invention, Dorothy Roberts, also write about using genetic tests not just to trace your genealogy in the United States and the specific experience of African Americans and Black people in the United States, but tracing your genealogy back to some geographical space on the continent. And many people have issues, many scholars have issues with that broader use of DNA ancestry tests and their results, because then you're really not connecting to a historic or even a contemporary ethnic group. And many sociologists will argue that there are other metrics if you want to have some sort of connection with a particular ethnic group, contemporary ethnic group on the continent today that one can use. And maybe we should be forming relationships and bonds based upon culture, right? Political activism against global subordination of Black and brown people. Those sorts of metrics might create a more meaningful connection as opposed to relying simply on a DNA ancestry test results. But again, the data seem to indicate that African Americans and Black individuals are not engaging in this reductionist analysis, but are using this information as part, as just one source of information and piecing together a really complex genealogical tapestry. Thanks for the question, Emma.
And then our final question comes from Deborah Che, and she says, the idea of race as biological essential characteristic has been discredited, leaving aside our disgraceful history in medicalizing Black and other non-white bodies. What is your perspective on research on disease that seems to be racially coded? You mentioned Tay-Sachs, or on the basis of, or on what basis do you think it should be pursued, if it should be pursued?
So I think that this is a really difficult question because even though race is clearly social and not genetic, there are variations related to ancestry and lineage with respect to how disease risk manifests. So an example that I'll give is that my guess is that many of you are familiar with the BRCA1 and 2 genes that if you have a particular variant of the BRCA1 or 2 gene, you might have a heightened risk for breast or ovarian cancer. And it turns out that that depending on your geographic ancestry, right, that actually the way the risk looks, you can have different sets of variants. And in populations that were non-European, so again, there's an overrepresentation of people with this European descent participating in medical genetics as well, that we were not good as a scientific community at identifying what risk looked like in other kinds of populations. That's clearly an oversight and a problem. Now, it would be a mistake to conflate the ancestry with race. So my position, and part of the difficulty I will openly say is that, you know, funding for genetic research often comes through grants, and grants are tied to health disparities research. So there are incentives for the scientists and the researchers to frame things in terms of race and ethnicity. But I think if we want to be responsible, what we need to do is just make sure that we are recruiting diverse groups of people with respect to the to genetic studies and then not classifying it based on race or ethnicity. But there's an inherent tension, I think, so I'm not a geneticist, I'm just a lawyer, but that I know from talking to folks that do this research, it's tricky because there's pressure based on the funding to study health disparities, and then it results in this unfortunate reification of race and tying particular kinds of genetic risks to particular groups.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Sorry, has your article been published yet? I did not think so. I just wanted to check before. So if anyone is interested in receiving it when it is published, feel free to contact me. And when it is published, I will send it all out to you. But thank you so much for coming to speak to us. This has been fantastic.